The stage pulled into Holt's Ford at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the town stopped what it was doing. Not all at once. It happened the way a fire catches in dry grass, one stalk at a time, spreading outward from the point where the wheels ground to a halt in the mud of the main street. The blacksmith looked up from his anvil. The woman sweeping the dry goods porch paused mid-stroke. Two men outside the saloon turned their heads and then turned them a little further and then stopped pretending they were doing anything else. The door of the stage swung open. Dorothea Vance stepped down. She was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, and solid in the way of a woman who has worked every day of her life and never once apologized for it. Her dress was dark wool travel-worn, the hem heavy with the mud of 3 different states. Her hair had come half loose from its pins somewhere east of Billings, and she had not fixed it because there had been other things to attend to. Her right hand carried a leather valise that weighed 18 pounds. She had weighed it twice before leaving Missouri because she was the kind of woman who weighed things twice. Her left hand was pressed flat against her side, holding the fabric of her sleeve against the wound beneath it. The wound was 3 inches long and clean as a whistle because the man at the Billings station who had tried to take her wedding ring had known how to use the knife he carried, even if he had not known how to finish what he started. Dorothea had not screamed. She had looked at the man, looked at the blood beginning to soak through the wool, picked up her valise from where it had fallen, and walked to her platform. The ring was still on her finger. She stood now in the mud of Holt's Ford's main street and let her eyes adjust to the late afternoon light. The town was not large. A single main street with buildings pressed together on both sides like books on a shelf that nobody had straightened in years. A saloon, a dry goods store, a livery, a building with a painted sign that said sheriff in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. At the far end, a white church with one of its shutters hanging crooked. She took it all in the way a woman takes in a new kitchen before she starts work. Noting what is there, noting what is not. A man near the saloon said something to the man beside him. The second man laughed, not quietly. Dorothea turned her eyes toward them. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Something in the steadiness of her gaze seemed to reach the laughing man before any words could have, and the laugh shortened itself and fell away into the mud like something that had lost its footing. She turned back to the street and started walking. She had not gone 20 feet before she heard the boots behind her. Quick steps, a woman's steps coming across the packed dirt of the porch at the dry goods store. "Ma'am," Dorothea did not stop. "Ma'am, your sleeve." She stopped, not because of the words, because of the voice behind them. There was no pity in it and no prurient curiosity and no performance of concern for the benefit of anyone who might be watching. There was only the plain fact of a woman who had seen a wound and meant to do something about it. Dorothea turned around. The woman who had spoken was perhaps 50 years old with gray streaks at both temples and hands that were red and capable in the way of someone who had spent decades doing work that mattered. She had a length of clean cotton cloth already folded in her palm, and she was looking at Dorothea the way a person looks at a problem they intend to solve, not admire. "Minna Galt," the woman said, "I'm the midwife hereabouts. I won't ask you a single thing you don't want to tell me." Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. Then she set the valise down in the mud. "Dorothea Vance," she said, "I'd be obliged." Minna Galt crossed the remaining distance between them with the careful, unhurried movement of a woman who knew how to approach something that was hurt without startling it. She pushed back Dorothea's sleeve without asking permission, because asking permission would have been a waste of both their time. The cut was clean, a knife cut, not a fall. Mina's mouth tightened, but she did not ask. She wrapped the cotton in 3 firm passes and tied it with the kind of knot that would hold through work and weather. and then she tucked the end and stood back. "That'll see you past the afternoon," she said. "You'll want it looked at proper before you sleep." "Thank you." "You're welcome." Mina paused. She looked at Dorothea the way women look at each other when they are deciding how much truth the other one can carry. Whatever she saw seemed to settle the question. "Mrs. Vance, I know who you are. Harlan Vance's wife." The sound of his name in another person's mouth was a thing Dorothea had not prepared for. She had thought she had prepared for everything. She found now that she had been wrong about that one thing, and only that one thing. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry about your husband, ma'am. He was a good man. He came into town on Sundays, and he was always decent to people, which is not a thing you can say about every man who rides for Brook Ranch." Dorothea looked down at the valise in the mud. The blood had reached the knuckle of her thumb now, but had stopped moving. "He wrote to me about this town," she said. "He liked it. He liked the people in it, I think." Minna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Vance, there's something you ought to know before you go any further up that road." Dorothea lifted her head. "Harlan didn't die because of an accident." Minna said it the way a person removes a splinter, quickly, because quickly is the kindest way. "He died because Fergus Daunt sent him out on a night when he had no business being sent." The street sounds continued around them. Somewhere a horse shifted its weight and a chain rattled. A door closed on the far side of the street. "Mr. Brooke gave the order to stay in that night," Minna continued. "The storm was coming and everyone knew it. But Daunt, he's the foreman at Brook Ranch, he told Harlan the north fence had to be mended before it hit. Told him the herd would scatter if it wasn't done. That fence wasn't Harlan's responsibility. It wasn't his section, but Daunt sent him anyway." Dorothea's hand tightened on the strap of her valise. "And Mr. Brooke," she said, "he knew this." Minna did not look away. "He knew it by the next morning, when they brought Harlan in. The silence between them was the kind that has weight to it, the kind you could press your hand against and feel pushing back." "And it has been 8 months, Dorothea said. "Yes, ma'am." Dorothea was quiet for so long that Minna began to look uncertain, as though she was wondering if she had said too much or not enough. Then Dorothea picked up her valise. "Mrs. Galt," she said, "where does Fergus Daunt eat his supper?" Minna blinked. "At Brook Ranch, at the long table same as the rest of the hands." "And what time does supper go on that table?" "7 o'clock, ma'am, has been for as long as I can remember." Dorothea looked at the position of the sun low and pale above the western ridge. She looked at the road that led north out of Holt's Ford, the road she had been asking about since she stepped off the stage. She picked up her valise. "Then I had better start walking," she said. Minna reached out and caught her wrist, not roughly the way you catch the arm of someone who is about to step into something they cannot see the bottom of. "Mrs. Vance, Brook Ranch is 6 miles up that road. The mud is deep from last night's rain. Your shoulder needs rest, not 6 miles of walking. And that ranch, it's not a gentle place. Daunt runs the yard, not Brook, whatever the deed says. There are 30 men out there who take their cues from him. You understand what I'm telling you." Dorothea looked at the hand on her wrist. Then she looked at Minna Galt. "My husband walked that road 8 months ago," she said. "He walked it to a job that was supposed to take him through the winter. He never walked it back." She paused. "I am going to where he stopped walking, Mrs. Galt, and I am going to the table where Fergus Daunt eats his supper, and I am going to do the one thing in this world that I came here to do." Minna released her wrist. "And what is that, ma'am?" "I am going to feed those men a proper meal," Dorothea said. Because my husband wrote to me in his last letter that they were eating burned beans and salt pork 3 times a day, and that the cook had left, and that he was going to write again when he had figured out a way to ask me to come up and do something about it. She looked down the road. He never got to write that second letter, so I am writing it for him. Minna Galt stood in the mud of Holtzford's main street and watched Dorothea Vance begin to walk north. She stood there until the woman had passed the last building and the road had bent around the cottonwood stand and she could no longer see her. Then she went inside and sat down and put her hands flat on her kitchen table and breathed, and after a while she got up and began to think about who she needed to talk to before morning. The cottonwood stand gave way to open land, and the open land was weighted and gray-green and indifferent in the way of Montana in October, when the warmth has gone out of the light even on the days when the light is there. The road was mud, as Minna had said, and the valise was 18 pounds, and the wound on Dorothea's shoulder had opened again somewhere around the 2nd mile, the cotton bandage darkening in a slow, irregular spread that she noticed and then put out of her mind. She walked anyway. She had been walking through things that hurt for long enough that the mechanics of it were no longer particularly interesting to her. The foot comes up, the foot goes down, the mud takes it for a moment and then releases it. Repeat. There was a kind of arithmetic to walking that she had always found steadying, the same way there was an arithmetic to cooking, to the ordering of ingredients, to the management of heat. One thing, then the next thing, the thing after that. You did not have to know the end to take the next step. You only had to know the next step. She had been walking for what she judged to be slightly more than a mile when she heard the horse. One horse moving at a steady pace from behind her. Not hurrying, not the pace of a man who had somewhere urgent to be. The pace of a man who was thinking carefully about what he was going to say when he got to where he was going. She did not turn around. She did not move to the side of the road. She walked down the center of it, and the horse came up alongside her and slowed, and a voice said, "Mrs. Vance." She kept walking. "Mrs. Vance, I would like a word." She kept walking. "I'm Stellenbrook." She stopped. She did not turn. She stood with her back to him and her valise in her right hand and the afternoon light coming from the west across the open country, and she waited. "I know who you are," she said. "Did Mrs. Galt send word ahead?" "Nobody sent word," he said. "I knew you were coming because Daunt told me 3 days ago that a woman had been asking questions about Brook Ranch in Billings. He has a man at the livery station there who keeps him informed. He described you in a way that left no room for doubt." A pause, boys. "I rode out to meet you. Did you come to send me back Mr. Brooke?" The question was not quite a question. It had the flatness of a statement that has already accepted its own answer. "I came to offer you a ride." "No, thank you." A silence, then, "I came to explain." She turned around. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He was older than she had expected, perhaps 58, with a face that had been worked on by weather and by something harder than weather, something interior and long-standing. His hat was gray and well-worn. His coat was the color of creek water in autumn. He held the reins loosely in one hand, and his other hand was resting on his thigh, nowhere near the revolver on his hip, which she noticed the way she noticed everything, filing it away without making a production of it. His eyes were the kind of dark that comes from looking at hard things for a long time and deciding to keep looking anyway. He had taken his hat off. That was something. "Mr. Brooke," she said, "did you know that Fergus Daunt sent my husband out on the night of the storm?" The horse shifted under him. He steadied it with a small pressure of his knee automatically without looking away from her. He did not answer. The silence stretched out across the road between them, across the gray-green land on both sides. A hawk moved somewhere, high up tilting on a current she couldn't feel from the ground, and the sound of the wind in the grass was the only sound there was. He did not answer, and that was his answer. Dorothea turned and started walking again. She heard him behind her, not following on the road, but moving off to the side of it, into the tall grass at the verge, and she understood without looking that he was not leaving. He was keeping pace with her from the edge of the road 20 yards back, his horse stepping carefully through the taller growth, choosing its footing the way a careful animal does when it is following a person who has not asked to be followed. She walked for a long while without speaking. Then she said without turning her head, "Why are you doing this, Mr. Brooke?" His voice came from slightly behind her and to the right. "Because Harlan Vance was a good man. Because what happened to him happened on my land under my name. Because I have not slept a whole night through since they brought him in." A pause. "Because whatever you came up here to do, Mrs. Vance, I figure you are owed the company on the road whether you want it or not." She walked. "Why haven't you sent Daunt away?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could hear the horse finding its way through the grass. "That is a question that deserves an honest answer." "Then give me one." Another silence. Longer this time, the kind of silence that precedes words that have been kept in a long time. "Daunt has a piece of paper with my signature on it," he said. "A standing order I signed giving him full authority over yard operations on nights when I wasn't available to be consulted. I signed it because it was convenient, because I didn't want to be woken up for small decisions at odd hours." The words came out with the labored quality of words that have been pressed down and are finally being allowed up. "The night of the storm I had been drinking. I had told everyone to stay in, but that order, it was still in force, and Daunt used it, sent Harlan out under the authority of my signature." A pause. "He has kept that paper. I expect he means to keep it for as long as it is useful to him." Dorothea walked. "That paper makes it difficult," she said. "That paper makes it feel impossible," he said. "There is a difference." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him across the 20 yards of grass between them. "Nothing about going to where my husband died felt possible this morning." "Mr. Brooke," she said, "I went to where he died anyway because someone had to. Sometimes the impossible thing is the only thing left." She looked at him a moment longer. "I will not be accepting your company, but I will not tell you to leave either. You ride where you choose." She turned and walked. He rode in the grass 20 yards back for the next 2 miles without coming closer and without falling behind. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could hear his horse in the grass, and the sound of it was not the sound of a man who intended anything except to keep a debt he had decided he owed. The yard of Brook Ranch was larger than she had pictured. The main house sat back from the gate, a long, low building of weathered timber that had started out plain and been added to in pieces over the years. Each addition slightly out of true with the one before it, so the whole thing had the look of something that had grown organically rather than been planned. Behind it, the bunkhouse was the longest single structure she had ever seen on a private property, 60 feet at least, with smoke coming from 2 chimneys and lamplight beginning to show in the windows against the falling dusk. There were corrals running back into the dimness beyond the barn, and the barn itself was cathedral-sized, its hayloft doors open to the evening air. Somewhere back in the corrals, horses were moving and occasionally calling to each other. Men were moving too, in and out of the bunkhouse and across the yard between the structures, Big men and lean men and men of every age between 20 and 60, and every single one of them stopped when she came through the gate. The stopping moved through the yard the same way the stopping had moved through the town, one man and then the next until the whole yard was still, and 31 faces were turned toward her, and the only sounds were the horses in the corrals and the wind over the ridge to the north. Stellenbrook rode in behind her and swung down from his horse. He did not reach for her valise. He did not take her arm. He moved to stand slightly behind her and to her left, and the message of that position was as clear as anything he could have said out loud. Boys, his voice carried across the yard without rising. This is Mrs. Vance, Dorothea Vance. She is Harlan's widow, and she is the new cook. The yard absorbed this in silence. A man came out of the bunkhouse door, large, very large, with a beard that had gone iron gray and a knife on his belt that was long enough to be something beyond a working tool. He had a piece of bread in one hand and a strip of rendered fat in the other, and he looked at Dorothea the way a man looks at something that has arrived in a place he considers his by right of occupation and time. The look he gave her was not surprise. It was something closer to preparation. Boss, his voice was the kind that had been used to giving orders for so long it had forgotten how to modulate itself for anything else. Fergus Daunt, he said, and he was speaking to Dorothea now, not to Stellan, because he had assessed the situation and decided she was the thing that needed to be addressed directly. You'll be Mrs. Vance. I will, she said. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so practiced it had ceased to carry any of its original meaning. Welcome to Brook Ranch, ma'am. And then still looking at her still with that expression that was not quite a smile, but was using the muscles a smile uses, I knew your husband. I know you did, Mr. Daunt, she said. Something shifted in his face. Just slightly, a recalibration behind the eyes. Is that so? It is. He wrote to me about this place every week, about the work and the country and the men here. She met his eyes and held them without blinking. He wrote about you. The yard was very still. Someone in the back had stopped, mid-motion with a boot in one hand. Daunt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, well, I hope what he wrote was favorable, ma'am. It was thorough, she said. He did not know what to do with that. She watched him decide whether it was a threat and choose not to decide yet. She let him sit with the uncertainty because uncertainty was the right place for him to be. She set her valise down in the dirt of the yard, the same careful way she had set it down in the mud of the town, the way a woman sets down a thing she fully intends to pick up again. She looked at the assembled men one face, and then the next slowly without hurry, because she had learned long ago that a room of strangers became less strange if you took the time to actually look at each person in it. What she saw was hunger. Not the hunger of men who had missed a meal. The hunger of men who had not been properly fed, not in any real sense in a very long time. It was in the way they were standing slightly forward, leaning imperceptibly toward her, even those who were trying to appear as though they had no particular feeling about any of this. It was in the way the youngest of them, a sandy-haired boy who couldn't have been more than 20, was looking at her with an expression so nakedly hopeful that it was almost painful to look at directly. She looked anyway. My name is Dorothea Vance, she said. I am Harlan Vance's wife. He came to this ranch 8 months ago to work, and he died here, and he was put in the ground in a blanket because there was no time for a coffin, and nobody sent me so much as a letter until 3 weeks after the fact, when the letter came from the county sheriff's office and not from this ranch. She let that sit for a moment. I did not come here about any of that. I came here because my husband wrote to me that the men on this ranch were eating burned beans and salt pork, and that the cook had gone, and that somebody ought to do something about it. I am somebody, so I am going to do something about it. A sound moved through the men, not words. Something more like the sound a held breath makes when it is finally released. Mr. Brooke, she turned to Stellan, where is the kitchen? He led her across the yard and she felt the men watching her go, felt the particular weight of 31 pairs of eyes tracking her passage, and she did not let it change her pace or her bearing by a single degree. Inside the bunkhouse, past the long table that ran the full length of the eating room, a door led to the kitchen. Stellan pushed it open and held it for her without comment. The kitchen was what she had known it would be. It was what every kitchen looked like when a cook had been gone for 5 months and only men of goodwill and no training had attempted to use it in the interim. The stove had not been blacked since summer and was buried under a gray accumulation of old grease and ash. Every surface held the evidence of cooking done in emergency and haste in the dark of half-knowledge. The wash bucket in the corner was full to its rim, with plates in a condition that had passed mold and arrived somewhere geological. The smell was the smell of defeat made physical and permanent. Dorothea stood in the doorway and looked at it for a full 10 seconds. Then she set her valise down on the one clean square foot of floor she could find near the base of the stove. She rolled up her good sleeve to the elbow. Mr. Brooke, she said, I need a bucket lye soap, hot water, and everything in this house that is edible and can be cooked in the next 2 hours, in that order. Yes, ma'am. He turned to go. Mr. Brooke. He stopped. She looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the kitchen, taking careful inventory of what was there and what was not. You will not call me Dorothea, she said, and I will not call you Stellan. Are we clear on that? He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face very briefly in the place where a man's face is not fully under his own management. Yes, ma'am. Good. Go on. He went. She was already shoveling cold ash out of the firebox when she heard the side door open behind her. Ma'am. Young voice, uncertain and braced. Ma'am, I'm the one who's been doing the cooking. She did not stop shoveling. You're the one who's been burning the cooking. A pause that contained several things at once. Yes, ma'am. What's your name? Tobit Lark, ma'am, Toby. How old are you, Toby? 17, ma'am. She stopped shoveling and turned to look at him. He was thin in the way of a boy who had grown too fast for his frame to keep up with all sharp joints and oversized hands that hadn't yet figured out what to do with themselves. His hair needed cutting. His eyes were the pale color that goes with red hair even when the hair itself has darkened toward brown with age. He was looking at her with the expression of someone bracing for something unpleasant that they have come to consider inevitable. She looked at him for a long moment without the expression he was expecting. Did anyone ever teach you to cook? She said. No, ma'am. Did you watch your mother? Something crossed his face. Quick and painful the way old things hurt when they are touched unexpectedly. She passed when I was 6, ma'am. Your father. He left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment except for the settling of ash in the firebox. Toby, she said, tonight I am going to show you how to feed 30 men a proper supper. You are going to watch, and you are going to help, and you are going to learn. And someday when there is someone in your kitchen who doesn't know how you are going to teach them, do you understand me? He blinked. His eyes had gone bright very suddenly, and he was clearly working hard to prevent them from doing anything further that he would have to manage in front of a stranger. Yes, ma'am. Good. Get your hands in that wash bucket. We have work to do. He moved. She turned back to the stove. It was then in the reaching, in the stretching, in the effort of pulling the heavy firebox drawer clear that she saw it. High on the shelf above the kitchen door, pushed to the back, where a tall man could put a thing he did not want a shorter man to find easily. A tin, small and rectangular, the kind that had originally held tobacco or stick matches. She had bought one exactly like it for Harlan in a general store in St. Louis the spring before he left for Montana. She had filled it with strike anywhere matches because he was always running out of them. She stood on the stool from the corner and reached up and took it down. The tin had a weight to it that was not the weight of matches. She held it in both hands and stood on the stool and did not move for a moment. Harlan's handwriting was on the inside of the lid, written in the pencil he always carried in his vest pocket. Small and careful the way he wrote when he was being deliberate about something, when he wanted the words to be exactly right and to stay that way. Dora, if you find this, I am already gone. Do not open it yet. You will know when after is. She stood on the stool with the tin in her hands. She stood there long enough that the ash she had disturbed settled again in a fine gray layer on the firebox door below. Then she climbed down. She put the tin in the pocket of her apron in the deep inner pocket that button closed the one she used for things she needed to keep safe through a long day's work. She felt it settle against her hip, warm from her hands, carrying a weight that was not the weight of paper. She went back to the stove. It was the kind of act that required a particular kind of courage, the setting aside of a thing that large, the saying of not yet to something that had been 8 months in the arriving. She had learned to do this over a long life of necessities, arriving in the wrong order of grief and grief's requirements, failing to align with the requirements of the world around them. You held the thing, you kept moving. Later, when the work was done and the kitchen was quiet and the door was locked and you were alone with it, you let the thing have its full moment. Later. Not yet. Toby came back hauling the hot water Stellan had sent, his thin arms shaking imperceptibly with the weight of the full bucket, his face set with the effort of not showing the shaking. She directed him to the wash basin without commenting on any of it, and set him to work on the dishes while she built the fire in the clean stove and began to take inventory of what was actually in the kitchen. The larder held what she had expected to find: a hindquarter of beef largely wasted by inexpert hacking, onions some beginning to soften at the centers, a sack of dried beans, cornmeal, salt, a dozen eggs that had been there longer than she preferred but were still sound, salt pork, lard in a stone crock, 2 quarts of milk fresh that someone had remembered to collect from the dairy cow that morning. She looked at the beef first. The cut marks were deep and uneven, the work of someone trying to remove meat from a carcass through force rather than knowledge, cutting across grain and sinew rather than along the seams nature had already provided. She looked at Toby. "Has anyone ever shown you how to break down a quarter of beef?" she said. He looked at the hanging carcass with honest appraisal. "No, ma'am, I just cut where it seemed like it needed cutting." "Get me the long knife from the block. The one with the curved blade, not the straight one." He got it. She rolled up the sleeve on her wounded arm, the bandage Minna had put on now fully soaked through and dark at the edges, and she went to work. As her hands moved through the familiar geography of the meat, finding the seams that a good knife follows, rather than forces, she talked. She described what she was doing and why. She explained the names of the cuts and the different ways of treating each one, what heat and time they wanted, and what they did not. She talked about the relationship between fat and flavor, and why fat rendered slowly was worth twice the fat rendered in a hurry. Toby listened. He was an extraordinarily good listener, she noticed. He had the quality of real attention, the kind that belongs to someone who is not waiting for their turn to speak, but is actually receiving what is being said. He asked questions that demonstrated he had understood the previous answer before he moved to the next one. He was smart in the particular way of people who have had to learn everything without help, which is to say he was efficient about what mattered and had no patience for what did not. She thought of Harlan, who had been exactly this kind of smart. She did not let that thought become a weight she could not set down. Outside, through the kitchen wall, she could hear the yard settling into the sounds of evening. The boot scrape and the low talk and the occasional bark of something that started as laughter and shortened itself. She had cooked in enough places to know when the men outside were listening, and these men were listening. The smell of real cooking was moving through the air and changing something in it the way certain smells do when they carry memory in them. She knew it was working because the voices outside had gone from the scattered sounds of a yard at the end of a workday to something quieter and more focused, the way a room sounds when people have stopped doing what they were doing and started paying attention to something else. They were not leaving. They were drawing closer. By the time the stew was on and the cornbread batter was resting, she judged there were at least 20 men standing within 30 feet of the kitchen door listening to the sounds of a kitchen that was being properly used for the first time in months. She told Toby to set the long table. He went and came back and said, "Ma'am, they're already at the table. All of them. Everyone, ma'am, Mr. Daunt, too." He paused, and something in his pause told her what was coming before he said it. "He's sitting in Mr. Vance's chair." Dorothea's hand went still on the spoon. She had not known that Harlan had a particular chair at the table. She had not known there was a chair considered his by right and custom. The knowing of it arrived the way these things arrive, not with warning, just with their full weight, and nothing softened. She breathed. She breathed again. Then she went to the kitchen door and opened it and looked across the eating room to where Stellan Brooke was standing at the far wall. "Mr. Brooke," he came to her. "Harlan had a chair at that table," she said, and her voice did not change, which was the product of a particular kind of will. "He was the senior hand on the North crew, ma'am, and a particular ma'am, senior hand sits at the head by custom. Mr. Daunt is sitting there now." Stellan looked at her steadily. "Yes, ma'am." "Move him," she said. "Move him before I bring that pot to the table. Mr. Brooke, or I will bring that pot to the table and I will pour it on his head. I want you to understand that is not a jest." Stellan Brooke looked at her for a long moment. Something happened in his face, in the place where a man's face is not under conscious control, the place around the eyes and at the corners of the mouth, and it was something that was not quite any single emotion, but contained several of them in close proximity, including something that looked like the first arrival of relief. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went. From the kitchen, she heard the exchange. Daunt's voice louder than the situation required. Then Stellan's voice lower and quieter, with the particular quality of a man who has not needed to raise his voice to be heard in a long time and sees no reason to start now. Then the scrape of a chair on plank flooring. Then silence. She brought the pot. 31 men sat at the long table. Stellan Brooke stood at the foot of it, his hat in his hand. The chair at the head was empty. She walked the length of the room and set the pot on the empty chair because the floor was uneven, and it was the steadiest surface available, and because of what she had already decided about that chair. She stepped back. She folded her hands. "Gentlemen," she said. 31 heads came up. Some still had their hats on. She looked at them without moving and without saying anything further. The hats came off one by one, and then all at once. "My name is Dorothea Vance. I am Harlan Vance's wife." I am your cook. Before anyone at this table picks up a spoon, we are going to bow our heads and give thanks for this food. And we are going to give thanks by name for the man who is not at this table tonight. Are we understood? A low sound moved down the table. Yes, ma'am, from the left side. Yes, ma'am, from the right. From Stellan Brooke at the foot, standing with his hat held against his chest. From Fergus Daunt, seated 3 places down from the head of the table, nothing. She looked at him. Mr. Daunt. He met her eyes. His face was arranged into a careful stillness. Are we understood? The room was so quiet she could hear the stew shifting in the pot, the slow, deep sound of liquid finding its level. Yes, ma'am, he said. She bowed her head. Lord, she said, we thank you for this food. We thank you for the hands that raise the cattle and the hands that ground the grain, for the fire that cooks it and the salt that seasons it. We thank you for the men at this table who work hard country for hard wages and do it every day without complaint. And we thank you for Harlan Vance, who is not at this table tonight, who ought to be and who will be remembered here by name as long as I am in this kitchen to remember him. Amen. The amen that came back was low and rough-edged and genuine. The amen of men who do not say the word often, but meant it on the occasions when they did. She picked up the ladle. She reached forward to fill the bowl in the empty chair at the head of the table, and the wound on her shoulder caught with the extension of the reach, and the ladle slipped, and a ribbon of hot broth ran across the back of her right hand. She did not flinch. She did not make a sound. She shifted the ladle to her good hand and filled the bowl. At the third seat down from the head, she was aware of Fergus Daunt watching the hand the broth had landed on. She was aware that he had seen the blood on her bandage spread now in a dark stain down the outside of her sleeve. She was aware of the expression that crossed his face for half a second before he arranged it back into the blankness he maintained. He had seen her hurt, and something in him had been satisfied by it. She kept that in the place where she kept things that were going to matter later, without making anything visible of the keeping. She filled every bowl down the length of the table. She went back to the empty chair and filled that bowl last, setting it there with the same deliberate care she had used for every other bowl. Mrs. Vance, Stellan's voice quiet from the foot of the table. That bowl is for Harlan, Mr. Brooke, she said without looking up from the pot. Nobody moves it, nobody touches it until this meal is over. Then I will take it out to the yard myself. Are we all understood on that? A low sound of assent from down the table, overlapping and genuine. Daunt said nothing. She watched the first spoon go into the first bowl. She watched it come up. She watched the sandy-haired young man at the far end of the table put it in his mouth and chew and stop chewing and sit very still for a moment. With an expression, she recognized the expression of someone who has just been given back something they had stopped believing still existed in the world. He ate. The man next to him picked up his spoon. Then the man beside him. Then the whole table seemed to move at once like a single thing that had been waiting for permission, and the sound of tin on tin filled the room. And at the far end, one man had turned his face away from the man next to him for reasons that had nothing to do with the food itself. She walked the length of the table with the pot and filled every bowl that had been emptied, and she did not look at Fergus Daunt, though she knew exactly where he was in the room at every moment. When she went back to the kitchen for the cornbread, she found Toby standing in the doorway between the two rooms watching the table with an expression she recognized as the expression of someone seeing something they had not expected to see and had not known they needed. Toby, she said. He startled back to himself. Ma'am. The cornbread. Yes, ma'am. He got the pan. She looked at him for a moment. You did good work tonight, she said. He looked up at her. The bright thing was back in his eyes that he was working to contain. "Thank you, ma'am." He looked down at the pan in his hands. "Mr. Vance used to tell me that when I did something right, he was the only one on this ranch who ever said it." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Go set the bread," she said. "Go on, then." He went. She put both hands flat on the work table and breathed. The tin in her apron pocket pressed warm against her hip through the fabric. "Not tonight," she told it silently. "Not yet. But soon. Soon I will be ready." When the meal was done and the last spoon had been set down, the sandy-haired young man stood up from the table. He took his hat off, even though it was already off, because he needed something to occupy his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I want you to know." He stopped. He started again. "That was the best thing I have eaten in my life. It was stew, Mr. Beckett Ames, ma'am. It was stew, Mr. Ames. Yes, ma'am. But it was stew somebody actually made." He looked at the hat in his hands. "I'd like to carry the pot back for you if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. He was perhaps 20 years old and completely in earnest. "Pick it up, then," she said. He picked it up like it was something that deserved to be handled carefully. Three other men stood and carried their plates toward the wash bucket without being asked. By the time she reached the kitchen door, 6 men were in line at the wash station, and the large man she had noticed earlier, broad-shouldered with a Scandinavian look about him, and hands that belonged on someone considerably larger, was already up to his wrists in soapy water and working through the first stack of plates. Toby appeared at her elbow. "Ma'am," he said very quietly, "they never done that before. Not once." "I know they haven't," she said. "Daunt didn't come." "No." She looked across the yard to where Fergus Daunt had positioned himself at the bunkhouse door, still and watchful the way a man stands when he has made several decisions and is waiting to act on them. He had been watching her all evening. He would watch her for every evening she remained here. And he would do more than watch, because men like Daunt always move from watching to doing, and he had already shown her something of what his doing looked like. But tonight was for the first work done, and for the bowl on the empty chair, and for Toby learning something real, and for Beckett Ames carrying a pot like it was precious. Tonight was not for anything else. "Come on," she told Toby. "Dishes." She went back into the kitchen. She picked up the washcloth and started on the work table, and the sounds of the yard came in through the window, and somewhere out there Stellan Brooke was watching the bunkhouse door where Daunt stood, and Daunt was watching the kitchen window where the lamp moved when she moved. She put her hand over the tin in her apron pocket once briefly through the cloth. A single moment of contact. "Wait for me, Harlan," she said inside herself where only she could hear it. "I am not ready yet, but I am coming. Soon." She picked up the cloth and went back to work, and in the morning there would be 31 men to feed, and she had better get the beans soaking before she slept. The beans were soaking by the time the last lamp in the bunkhouse went dark. Dorothea stood at the kitchen window and watched the night settle over the yard. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals that pulsed slowly orange in the dark of the firebox, and the kitchen smelled of rendered fat and onion and the particular warmth of a room that has recently been used well for the purpose it was built for. She had swept the floor and scoured the work table and organized the larder shelf by what would spoil first and what would hold, pressing her own mark into the lid of each container with the tip of her paring knife. She had not planned those marks for the reason she would end up needing them. She had simply learned over years of cooking in places where interference was a possibility that a kitchen where everything is known and accounted for is a kitchen where chaos has fewer places to enter. She went to bed on the cot Stellan had set up in the back room of the kitchen behind the door that opened to the larder corridor. She did not take the bunk he had offered in the main house. She did not take the room on the second floor of the bunkhouse that one of the hands had vacated. She took the cot in the kitchen because the kitchen was hers, and she understood instinctively that the first rule of any territory you intend to hold is that you sleep in it. She put her hand over the pocket where the tin lay, the apron folded now, on the chair beside the cot. Not yet, she said to it. She closed her eyes and was asleep before the thought had fully formed. She woke to the wrong smell. It reached her before consciousness was fully assembled, before she had opened her eyes or remembered where she was. There are certain things the body recognizes before the mind does, because the body has been engaged in the work of keeping a person alive considerably longer than the mind has been paying careful attention. Wood smoke was not the wrong smell. Wood smoke was ordinary. The smell of the stove banked for the night, of the bunkhouse chimneys, of the land itself in the cold months when everything burns something to stay warm. But this was not the warm, contained smell of a controlled fire in a proper flue. This was the smell of grass and dry timber, and the particular sharpness of old hay catching in a place where it was not supposed to be burning. She was on her feet before her eyes were open. She crossed the kitchen and pushed through the outer door into the yard, and what she saw in the upper corner of the bunkhouse roofline made the cold October air feel colder than it was. Along the eastern corner of the second floor overhang, where the dry hay had been stuffed under the eaves for winter insulation, the deep red of combustion was working through material that was about to give it everything it needed to become something much larger and much faster. She turned back into the kitchen. Toby. She did not shout. She said it at the volume of a woman who expects to be heard and knows she will be. Toby, get up right now. From the lean-to behind the larder, the immediate sound of a body leaving sleep in a single movement. Ma'am, what? Fire on the bunkhouse roof, east corner, ring the bell. He was through the kitchen and across the yard before the sentence was finished, moving with the loose-limbed speed of a boy who has gone from deep sleep to full motion in under 4 seconds. The iron bell at the corral post, the one used for meals and emergencies, and nothing else, began to clang in a way that was physically painful at this hour, and in this silence, a sound designed to reach into sleep and drag men out of it by force. Dorothea stood in the center of the yard and watched the corner of the roof. The glow was spreading. Within 90 seconds, the first men were out of the bunkhouse in their long underwear, some with boots and some without, also moving toward the water troughs and the bucket line with the automatic efficiency of men who had drilled for exactly this. On a ranch with this much timber in this dry season, fire was not something you thought about. You only moved. Stellan Brooke came down the exterior staircase of the main house at a controlled run, already in his coat and boots, already reading the situation. He went up the roof ladder with a wet blanket over his shoulder and the focused calm of a man who has done dangerous things before and has learned that the only useful thing to bring to them is clarity. The bucket line formed. Water passed from hand to hand. The fire caught early, fought back with the petulant intensity of something It erupted before it had achieved what it meant to achieve. The wet blanket came down on the glowing overhang. More water followed. Then more. 20 minutes after the bell began, it was out. Thin, pale threads of smoke continued to rise from the corner of the roof, and the smell of it was in everything now, in wool and hair and the cold air itself. The men stood in the yard, breathing hard, some with soot on their faces, passing a water bucket for drinking, and not talking much. Stellan Brooke came down the ladder with his hands darkened to the wrists and his coat carrying the smell of something that had been very close to becoming much worse. He crossed the yard in long, direct strides and came to where Dorothea was standing. That fire was set, he said. Yes, she said. It was set in the hay under the eastern overhang. He looked at her with the steadiness of a man delivering information he would prefer not to be delivering. Directly above the room on the second floor, the one I offered you. The one I didn't take. Yes, ma'am. Because I took the cot in the kitchen instead. Yes, ma'am. A pause. Mrs. Vance, I want you in the main house tonight. There is a room with a bolt on the inside of the door, and I will stand the watch in the hallway myself until morning. No, Mrs. Vance. If I move tonight, he wins, she said, and there was nothing in her voice but the fact of the statement. He moves me out of the kitchen, and the kitchen is mine. I will fix the lock on the kitchen door in the morning. I will sleep in the kitchen the night after that and the night after that, until the man who set this fire is no longer on this property. Stellan looked across the yard. At the bunkhouse door, Fergus Daunt leaned against the frame with the particular stillness of a man who has been awake and dressed and waiting. His hat was on, his boots were on. He was the only man in the yard who had come out of that building fully clothed and fully composed, and they both understood what that meant, and Daunt knew they understood it, and none of it appeared to trouble him at all. Stellan took one step toward the bunkhouse. Mr. Brooke, her voice stopped him without sharpness. Not tonight. He stopped. That is exactly what he wants, she said. You go at him now in the dark without a witness who carries any weight, and by tomorrow morning there is a formal complaint with the county, and you are the man who attacked his own foreman in the yard, and Daunt is the one who was wronged. That is how it works, and you know it. Stellan stood with his back to her, looking across the yard at the man in the doorway. 40 feet of hard-packed dirt between them, and it had the quality of no distance at all. She watched his hands the way they had stopped, in the position of a man who has decided something and is managing the decision. He turned around. Yes, ma'am. The words came out like something released against resistance. Good, she said. Go wash your hands. I'll put the kettle on. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite identifiable. You heard me, she said. Go on. He went. She put the kettle on and stood at the kitchen window while the water heated, watching the yard settle as the men returned to the bunkhouse in ones and twos. Dawn had not moved from the doorframe. She watched him stand there, and she thought carefully about everything that had been set in motion and everything that was going to follow from it. Toby appeared in the doorway, his hair in extraordinary disorder from sleep and movement, his eyes wide with something that was not quite settled. Ma'am, are you all right? I'm fine, Toby. Go back to bed. Ma'am, that fire was set on purpose. I know what it was. Go back to bed. You'll need to be up in 4 hours for breakfast. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has several things to say and has decided this is not the moment for them. Then he went. She made 2 cups of tea when the kettle boiled and carried them out to the porch steps where Stellan was sitting with his cleaned hands resting on his knees, still carrying the smell of smoke in his coat. She sat 2 feet away from him and handed him a cup and looked out at the dark yard without speaking. They sat quietly for a while. The stars were very clear. The temperature had dropped the way mountain temperatures drop in October, not with wind, but with the settled permanence cold that had arrived and intended to stay. Then Stellan said, I owe you a full accounting, Mrs. Vance. Yes, she said. You do. Another silence. He looked into the cup. The standing order I gave Daunt, he said. I signed it 3 years ago when I had a problem with decisions being made in my absence without proper authority. Things going wrong at odd hours because there was no clear chain of command. It seemed like a reasonable, practical solution at the time, giving the foreman authority to act on my behalf when I wasn't available. He paused. I did not drink regularly in those days. I had started by the time of the storm last winter. Not heavily, but enough. Enough that I did not want to be consulted that night. Enough that I had told everyone to stand down and expected to be left alone with it. He looked up at the sky over the ridge. I did not know Daunt would use the order the way he used it. I did not know he had a reason to want Harlan out of the yard that night. I did not know any of it until the morning they brought him in. Dorothea held the cup in both hands and let the warmth move through her palms. What reason did Daunt have? She said. Money, a wage dispute. I have not been able to get the particulars because the man who has the particulars has been afraid to speak for 8 months. He paused. A hand named Orrin Yates. He's still on the ranch, 6 years good worker, and he has not said a word to me about any of it. And the paper, she said. Daunt still has it. He has it. He has made it clear to me in the way men like Daunt make things clear without ever stating them directly that the paper exists and that using it would cause me significant difficulty. My signature authorizing his actions, the date predating the storm by 14 months. He looked at his hands. With that paper and a lawyer who wanted to make a case of it, it could be argued that I authorized the order that sent Harlan out. Not Daunt, me. The yard was very quiet. How long have you been carrying that Mr. Brooke? He considered the question precisely. Since the morning they brought him in, he said, 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. She looked at him. In the thin light from the kitchen window, his face was the face of a man who has spent a long time in a confined space with something very heavy, and the confinement and the weight have begun to show in his structure. She recognized it. She had seen it in the mirror every morning for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Then it is past time to set it down, she said. He looked at her. Not the fact of it, she said. I am not asking you to pretend it didn't happen. I am saying that carrying a thing alone in the dark makes it heavier every day you carry it. You set it down by speaking it aloud to the people it concerns. The truth has a weight when it is kept private. When it is spoken, the weight distributes. Other people carry their portion of it. That is the way truth is designed to function. He was quiet for a long time after that. Beside her, the yard was still. You sound like a woman who has done this before, he said. I have buried a child and a husband, she said. You learn things or you don't survive the learning. He did not say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She had received enough offered sorrow in the past 8 months to fill the kitchen twice over, and none of it had lightened anything by a single ounce. He just sat with what she had said. The way men sometimes sit with hard things when they have enough experience of hard things to know that sitting with them is sometimes all there is to do. They finished their tea. The yard stayed quiet. At some point, Daunt had gone inside. Tomorrow, she said, standing and taking his empty cup. I want to propose something to you. I wanted you to hear all of it before you refuse. He looked up at her from the step. That is not an encouraging way to begin. It is not meant to encourage, she said. It is meant to be accurate. Good night, Mr. Brooke. She went inside and propped a chair against the kitchen door handle and lay down on the cot with her hand over the tin through the fabric of the folded apron. One more day, she told it. One more thing to get through first. She was not entirely certain that was true, but she had decided it needed to be, and sometimes deciding was what made a thing true. She slept. In the morning, she found the salt. She had been in the kitchen for an hour before Toby arrived, building the fire and setting the oatmeal and preparing the biscuit dough, and she went to the front sugar tin for the biscuits and tasted what she took from it before she used it, because that was what she always did in a kitchen. she had not yet fully mapped. The granules dissolved on her tongue and were not sweet. She set the tin on the work table and looked at it. Then she went to the larder and tasted every container on the open shelves one by one methodically. The pepper held pepper, the salt held salt. The cornmeal was cornmeal. The second sugar tin, the one at the back of the lower shelf, the one with her initials pressed into the lid on the first night, held sugar. Someone had been in this kitchen between the time she went to sleep and the time she woke this morning. Toby came through the door at that moment, pulling his coat straight. He stopped when he read her face. "Ma'am, what happened?" "Salt in the front sugar tin," she said. "Someone switched them in the night." He went still. Then an expression crossed his face that was between guilt and relief, the expression of someone who knows something they have been deciding whether to say. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I tasted it last night," he said. "After the fire, when I came back in to get a drink of water. I couldn't settle, so I came to the kitchen and I thought I should check the tins because you told me to." "I told you to last night." "Yes, ma'am, before supper. You said, 'Toby, from now on, you taste every tin in this kitchen before you put it in anything because we cannot be careless about anything in here.'" She had not said that. She had thought it completely formed at some point during the meal, while she was watching Dawn's face and thinking through what a man like that would do when he decided to move. She had thought it, and then the meal had happened, and the afterward, and the fire, and the tea on the steps, and she had gone to bed without saying it aloud. She had thought it. She had not said it. She looked at Tobit Lark, 17 years old, thin as a fence rail and considerably sharper than the wire on it. "You are a good boy, Toby," she said. He looked at his boots. "I just thought it seemed like something you would say, ma'am. Throw the salt out. Get me sugar from the sealed crock in the back of the larder. The one with the cloth tied over the top." "Yes, ma'am." He went. She sat down on the kitchen stool for the length of time it took her hands to stop their very small and private trembling, and she breathed, and then she stood up, the tin pressed against her hip through the apron pocket. "One more thing," she told it. "One more, then I will be ready." She stood up and made the biscuits and went to find Stellenbrook. She found him in the small office off the parlor of the main house, going through a ranch ledger with the particular unhappiness of a man doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across the desk from him without waiting to be invited, because there was no time for waiting. "The cook-off," she said. He put the pencil down and looked at her. "A cooking competition, public. Every person on this property present. Daunt and I each cook one dish. Every man votes. The one who loses leaves Brook Ranch and does not come back by the terms of a formal agreement witnessed by everyone present." He looked at her in the way of a man who cannot immediately locate the refusal he needs. "Daunt will not agree to this." "Daunt will agree because refusing costs him more than agreeing. If he refuses, every man in this yard knows he is afraid of a woman with a pot and a cook fire. That is not something he can afford, not with the authority he has built on 30 men believing he fears nothing." She folded her hands on the desk. "He will agree, and he will be confident because he has been feeding himself and occasionally someone in town for 6 years, and he believes that is the same thing as cooking. It is not. Mrs. Vance, if you lose, my mother fed 8 children in a Tennessee winter that killed half the cattle in the valley," she said, "on cornmeal and lard and 1 chicken a week, and not one of those children went to bed hungry. Fergus Daunt has been cooking for himself. Announce the cook-off. Announce that every person on this ranch gets a vote, every person including Toby." Stellan looked at her for a long moment. And the women, he said. She looked at him. She had not expected this. There are women in this town who have a right to what happens on this ranch, Mrs. Vance. I was thinking of asking Mrs. Galt to come, and others. He paused. If that would be appropriate. She looked at him carefully. The question beneath the question was clear enough. Yes, she said, that would be appropriate. You invite them yourself. You make it clear they are welcome and that their vote counts the same as any man's. And you do it today, not tomorrow. Today. Daunt is already moving on the sugar tins. I would prefer not to give him another night's worth of planning time before we settle this. He nodded slowly and then with more conviction. I'll send Beckett Ames to town this morning. She stood. Tell him to ride fast, she said, and to bring whoever will come. She went back to the biscuits. Fergus Daunt laughed when the cook-off was announced at breakfast. He laughed the way a man laughs at something he believes cannot hurt him, with his whole chest and loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. And he slapped the flat of his palm on the tabletop and looked down the length of the table at the assembled hands. Boys, he said, I'll cook that woman back to Missouri by sundown and be eating her share of breakfast before the sun's up tomorrow. Not one man laughed with him. Not the man to his left, who found something interesting about his biscuit. Not the man to his right, who appeared to be studying the ceiling. Not Beckett Ames, who was already pulling on his coat to ride for town, and who looked at Daunt directly with an expression that had resolved into something settled and clear. Daunt looked down the table at the faces of 30 men, and the laughter shortened itself and stopped. He picked up his fork. Sundown, us down, he said to nobody in particular. We'll see about it. By noon, 27 of the 31 men had quietly stopped speaking to Fergus Daunt. The 3 who had not were the 3 who slept in his corner of the bunkhouse and whose loyalty had been built over years through small dispensations of favor and protection. Dorothea spent the afternoon in the kitchen doing what could be done in advance and planning what could not. She was methodical because she was methodical about everything, and she did not perform it for the benefit of anyone watching. Though she knew people were watching because people had been watching her since she came through the gate, and she had stopped expecting otherwise. She simply worked efficiently and without theater and let the work speak for itself. Toby worked beside her. He was learning the names of things, which was more important than it might have appeared, because a person who knows the names of things has a working language for a kitchen, and a person with that language can think in it rather than just react. She tested him on the cuts of beef, and he had most of them. She tested him on the dried herbs and spices, and he had all of them because he had been examining them curiously every morning since she arrived and had apparently been conducting private research. You have a good memory, she told him. He shrugged with elaborate casualness. I remember things I care about, he said. I just don't care about many things. What do you care about? He thought about it with the seriousness of someone who takes questions seriously. The horses, he said, and this. He was quiet for a moment. The cooking, I didn't expect to, but I do. She looked at him. Mr. Vance told me once, he said carefully, that the difference between a man who is good at what he does and a man who is just doing it is whether he can feel the thing he's working with. He said it about fencing, about knowing when wire has the right tension in it. But I think it's true about more than fencing. She turned back to the work table. It is true about everything that matters, she said. The women arrived from town at 4 o'clock in Beckett Ames's wagon. Minna Galt was first to step down, her capable hands finding the wagon's sideboard with the ease of a woman who has climbed in and out of wagons in every weather and every condition. She looked across the yard to Dorothea and gave a single nod, the nod of a woman who has made a commitment and intends to make good on it. The second woman was small and held herself with the particular upright quality of someone who has made a decision about her spine and intends to keep it. Dorothea did not know her. The third was younger, perhaps 25, with a child settled on her hip and the look of someone who has recently arrived at a decision she is still examining from all sides. The fourth woman stopped something in Dorothea's chest for a moment. She was perhaps 50, dressed in black that was not new, and she descended from the wagon with a deliberateness that was clearly conscious each step onto this particular ground, a thing she was actively choosing rather than simply doing. She looked at the ranch yard the way you look at a place that did something to you once that it cannot undo. Beckett Ames helped her down last, and his face when he looked at her was the face of a young man who has been worried about someone he loves for a long time and has not fully stopped being worried. Minna Galt brought the women across the yard to Dorothea. She introduced the upright woman as a rancher's wife from the North Road. She introduced the young woman with the child. Then she stopped. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "this is Winifred Ames." Dorothea looked briefly at Beckett, who was absorbed in a careful inspection of his wagon wheel. Then she looked at Winifred Ames. "Beckett's mother," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Winifred looked at the ranch yard in its entirety, at the bunkhouse and the main house and the corrals and the barn, taking it in the way you take in a place from a bad dream, not because it is monstrous, but because it is ordinary. And that is exactly where the terrible thing happened. "My husband died on this property 4 years ago," she said. "I have not come back since the morning they brought him home." "I know," Dorothea said. "I am glad you came today." Winifred looked at her. "Minna told me about the bowl on the empty chair. The first night." "Yes." "For Harlan." "Yes." Winifred was quiet for a moment, and what moved in her face was the quiet of something that has been still for a long time beginning to move again. "My husband's name was Reed," she said. "Odie put a bowl out for Reed, not on this property." Dorothea held her gaze. "Mrs. Ames," she said, "if you will come to supper after this is finished, I will put a bowl on that empty chair for Reed Ames, and I will say his name in front of every man at that table. You have my word." Winifred's jaw moved once. She pressed her lips together for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier than before. "That is exactly why I came, Mrs. Vance, and why I intend to vote." Dorothea showed the women to the bench along the kitchen wall that she and Toby had built the day before, a long flat board on 2 sawhorses covered with a folded horse blanket. It was not fine, it was there and it was for them, and it was more than this property had offered women before. The cooking stations went up in the yard as the light began its shift toward evening. 2 stoves brought out a storage leveled on the packed earth with wedges of cut timber. 2 work tables, same wood, same water from the same pump, same amount of starting time. The whole of Brook Ranch was in the yard. 31 men, 4 women. Toby, standing in the kitchen doorway, told he could not vote because he worked for one of the competitors, wearing the expression of someone who intends to watch every second regardless. Stellan Brooks stood on an upturned crate near the water trough. He had put on a clean coat, which Dorothea noticed and placed in the account she was keeping. Fergus Daunt arrived at his station with a market basket from town and set out his ingredients with the deliberate showmanship of a man who understood that the appearance of abundance was worth something before a single thing had been cooked. Quail, 4 of them plucked and dressed, a small jug of heavy cream, a bottle of red wine, white flour in a cloth sack, a 1/4 pound of good butter, and 2 oranges. 2 oranges. In October, in Montana. She heard the low sound that moved through the assembled men when they saw the oranges and knew that Daunt had calculated that sound precisely, had paid for it at the mercantile that morning, and was collecting on the investment now. She looked at her own work table: a sack of cornmeal, a pound of salt pork, 6 onions, a head of cabbage from the root cellar, a tin of salt, a pitcher of cold fresh milk. That was everything. Daunt looked at her table and made a sound that was theatrical in its sympathy. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll be plain with you. I almost feel sorry for you standing there." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I genuinely do, ma'am." "Mr. Daunt," she said, "I have been hearing men feel sorry for my cooking since I was 9 years old." She turned to her stove and opened the damper with a firm hand. "Get to the cooking." The yard laughed, the real kind, the helpless kind that comes out of a person before they have made a decision about it. Something shifted in Daunt's color. He began to cook. He cooked the way she had anticipated he would cook, which was the way a man cooks when he wants to be observed cooking. Every motion a degree larger than necessary. The quail went into the pan with a sizzle that carried across the yard. The cream reduced with a satisfying sound. The wine went in with a bursting amber pour that caught the last of the afternoon light, and several of the men made sounds of genuine appreciation because it was genuinely beautiful to watch. Dorothea cooked the way her mother had cooked. She put the salt pork in the pan cold and let it come up slowly because fat rendered slowly gives you more to work with and costs you nothing but patience. She poured the excess into a jar because nothing is wasted in a kitchen that has learned what scarcity means. She cut the onions fine and let them go soft in the fat without hurrying them because hurried onions taste like hurried onions, and patient onions taste like something else entirely. She poured in the milk and stirred in the cornmeal, working the lumps out one at a time. Cornbread, just cornbread. While it baked, she dressed the shredded cabbage with vinegar and rendered fat and a proper measure of salt, and she tasted it and adjusted and tasted again. When the bread came out of the oven, it was the color of late afternoon sunlight, and it smelled the way certain things smell when they carry memory in them, when they are not simply food, but the idea of being fed made real and warm. She heard the yard go quiet. Not the polite quiet of people watching a demonstration. The quiet of people who have all felt something at the same moment and are privately trying to determine what to do about it. She split the bread open while it was still steaming and laid the salt pork back across it. That was her dish. Daunt plated his quail in cream sauce on white china from the main house, with the orange peel curled at the rim of the plate. It was accomplished cooking. The men who looked at it made sounds of honest admiration because it deserved honest admiration. When Dorothea set her cornbread on a tin plate from the bunkhouse, the yard did not applaud. It went completely still, not the still of disappointment, the still of a yard full of people who have all been struck by the same thing at the same time and are each privately in the first moment of understanding what it is. Beckett Ames came forward as the designated taster. He stood before the two plates. He tasted Daunt's quail first as the agreed order required, and he nodded once with genuine respect because it was good, and he was an honest young man, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Then he picked up a piece of cornbread. He put it in his mouth. He chewed once. He stopped chewing. He stood very still with the cornbread in his mouth and did not move, and the yard watched him stand there, and nobody said a word. His eyes filled, not the way eyes fill when a person is performing, the way eyes fill when something arrives that was not expected, something from years back that a person had stopped believing they would encounter again. He sat down on the ground, not in a chair. There was no chair. He sat down on the packed dirt in front of the work table and put his face in both hands. "Mr. Ames," Dorothea said quietly, You were meant to say a word for the yard. From behind his hands, muffled and certain, my mother used to make this, ma'am. The yard was completely silent. Did she? Dorothea said. She died when I was 11. He did not lift his face. I have not eaten this since she died. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then from the bench along the kitchen wall came the sound of boots on packed earth, measured and deliberate and decided. Dorothea looked up. Winifred Ames was crossing the yard. She walked past Fergus Daunt without looking at him. She walked past Stellan Brooke. She walked through the 30 men who parted for her without being asked, and she walked to where her son was sitting on the ground with his face in his hands, and she put her palm on the top of his head once gently the way you touch something you have carried a long worry about. Then she straightened and looked at Dorothea. Mrs. Vance, she said, you know who I am. You know why I came. She looked at Stellan on his crate. I was told every person here gets a vote. Yes, ma'am, Stellan said. They do. Then I vote for Mrs. Vance. She went back to the bench. Minna Galt stood. I vote for Mrs. Vance. The rancher's wife stood and voted. The young woman with the child stood and voted, the child watching everything with wide, solemn eyes. Then Beckett Ames got up from the dirt and brushed his knees off and straightened his hat with a hand that had steadied itself while nobody was watching. I vote for Mrs. Vance, he said, and his voice was clear. The men began to stand, one at first, then two together, then a general rising that moved down the table like something inevitable, like a thing that has been building pressure for longer than this afternoon, longer than 3 days, longer perhaps than 5 months, of burned beans in the silence of a kitchen that had been given up on. 27 men standing, 28, 29. The three from Daunt's corner of the bunkhouse stayed seated. Then the youngest of them, 19 years old, with a nose that had been broken at least once and not set quite straight afterward, looked at the standing men. He looked at Daunt. He looked at Toby Lark in the kitchen doorway with cornbread crumbs on his lip and an expression of barely contained everything. He stood up. I vote for Mrs. Vance, he said. Daunt's head turned toward him with a slowness that was worse than speed. Boy, he said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that was more dangerous than loud. You sit back down right now. I vote for Mrs. Vance, the boy said again, and sat back down and stared at the dirt. The count was 29-2. Stellan Brooks stepped down from the crate. He walked across the yard to where Daunt was standing and stopped 3 feet from him and looked at him with the direct, unhurried regard of a man who has been waiting a long time to be in a position to do exactly this. Fergus, he said, pack your gear. You are off this ranch by sunrise. Brooke, Daunt's voice had lost everything it usually wore. What was underneath was older and harder and less managed than anything he had shown before. You cannot do this. I just did it, Stellan said without raising his voice. You'll have your final wages in the morning. You'll be off the property before the men sit down to breakfast. Are we clear? That paper, Daunt said. His eyes had found Dorothea and stayed there. The paper with your signature on it, I'll take that to the county and tell them you ordered it. You take whatever you like to whoever you like, Stellan said. I will be there when you do. Something in Daunt's face shifted. The constant low-level calculation that had been running behind his eyes since the moment she arrived at this ranch seemed for the first time to falter. He looked at Stellan, he looked at the yard, he looked at the 31 men standing and the 4 women on the bench. And then his eyes found Dorothea and what she was holding. She had taken the tin from her apron pocket. She had not made a production of it. She had simply taken it out and was holding it in both hands the way she had been holding it in the back of her mind for 4 days. Daunt looked at the tin. The color left his face all at once, the way a lamp goes out when the wick is cut, not gradually but completely. He knew what was in it. She could see that he knew in the way his body changed, in the way the calculation behind his eyes was replaced by something that was not calculation at all, but its opposite. She did not know whether Harlan had told someone or whether Daunt had found the tin and read it and replaced it, thinking she would never find it, or whether he had simply understood from the fact of its existence that Harlan was the kind of man who would leave a letter. But he knew, and he understood what the knowing meant for him. Before anyone could move to close the distance, Daunt turned and walked for the corrals at a pace that was just short of running. The walk of a man whose arithmetic has just produced a number he cannot argue with. He hit the corral fence at a dead run and was halfway over the top rail before Stellan's voice crossed the yard. "Fergus?" Daunt stopped on top of the rail. "Step down." "You said pack and go by sunrise," Daunt said. "I'm going." "You haven't packed. You're running." Stellan looked at him across the yard. "Step down, Fergus. I am going to count to 3, and I want you to think carefully about what happens on 3. The yard held completely still. "1," Stellan said. Dorothea watched Daunt on top of the rail. She watched his hands on the post and his eyes doing the arithmetic of distance and darkness and pursuit. "2," Stellan said. Daunt dropped down on the inside of the corral. The large Scandinavian hand who appeared to operate on a system of direct physical logic, uncomplicated by deliberation of any kind, crossed the yard without being asked, and took Daunt by the back of his collar, with a grip that offered no options, and walked him back to the center of the yard and set him down in the dirt with the gentle certainty of a man who weighs 270 pounds and has made up his mind about something. Daunt stayed where he was put. Stellan looked at Dorothea across the yard. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "he is going to stand in this yard and listen to you read that letter, every word, out loud, so that every person here can hear it." Dorothea looked at the tin. She thought about what Harlan had written on the inside of the lid. "You will know when after is." She looked at the yard, 31 men and 4 women, Toby in the kitchen doorway with cornbread crumbs on his lip, Beckett Ames standing with his mother's hand on his arm, Winifred Ames, who had walked back onto this property for Reed, Minna Galt, who had bandaged a wound on a muddy street and told the truth because the truth was owed. The empty chair at the head of the table visible through the open bunkhouse door and the bowl she had set there still untouched. She knew when after was. It was now. She opened the tin. The letter was folded in thirds the way Harlan always folded his letters, the same fold in every letter he had sent her in the 8 months he had been here. She unfolded it carefully, his handwriting steady at the top of the page, shakier near the bottom where the hour or the emotion or both had found their way into his hand. She looked up at the yard. "Out loud," Stellan said, "every word." "Yes," she said. She began to read. The yard was so quiet that she could hear the horses shifting in the corrals 50 yards away. Dorothea held the letter and looked at the first line and understood, in the way you understand things you have been prepared for without knowing you were being prepared, that what she was about to read would change the shape of everything that had come before it. Not unmake it, not erase it, change its shape the way light changes when it moves through a different window, illuminating things that were already there but had been standing in the dark without anyone looking at them. She began. "Dora," she read, "if you are reading this, I am already gone, and I am sorry for that. There is a thing I have not told you. I have not told you because I could not find the words. And because every time I began to write them down, I understood that putting them on paper would make them more real than I was prepared for them to be. But a thing that is not told will not stay buried. It works its way out of the ground eventually, and I would rather you hear it from me than discover it another way. The yard did not breathe. 2 years ago, when Clara was born, and when the bleeding began and would not stop, I rode to town for the doctor. You know this part. What you do not know is that the man who came back with me was not a doctor. Dorothea's voice held steady. She had not known. She had suspected nothing. She had been in the bed with the bleeding that would not stop, and a man had come in with a black bag and a clean coat and had looked at her with the expression of someone who knew what he was doing, and she had believed him because she had needed to, because the alternative was too large to hold at the same time as everything else. His name was Silas Drum. He came down from Billings on the morning stage. He had a black bag and a clean coat, and he was fluent enough in the language of medicine to seem credible to a woman in the condition you were in. He could not do what a doctor can do. He did not know how. He held Clara and said the things a doctor says, and our daughter died 4 days later of bleeding that a trained physician could have stopped. The letter moved slightly in her hands. She steadied them against her thigh. I did not know any of this when it happened. I did not know it for 2 full years after. I found out 11 months ago here in this bunkhouse from a man named Orrin Yates, who had been drinking since supper and who told it to me the way you tell a story about someone else, as though he assumed I already knew and we were simply discussing it together. He laughed at one point, Dora. He laughed because he thought Daunt had played a fine joke on me sending a false doctor rather than paying what he owed. From somewhere in the yard, a sound, low and involuntary, the sound a man makes when something lands before he has had time to brace for it. Daunt owed me 2 months of wages, $60. He settled the debt by putting Silas Drum on the morning stage with $4 in his pocket and instructions to say whatever a doctor would say. Clara died because Daunt owed me $60 and did not want to pay it. Dorothea stopped. She breathed once fully and read on. When Yates told me, I went to the barn, and I sat there for a long time with the revolver I carry. I want you to know that, Dora, because I want you to understand that what I chose was not the easy choice, and I am not pretending otherwise. I had the gun loaded. I had thought through the where and the when and what I would say to him first. I had 90 nights on this cot to think it through until it was a clear and detailed plan. And I could not carry it out, not from fear, because I could not come home to you with another man's blood on my hands, not with Clara's name still fresh on the stone, not with yours still on my lips every night before I closed my eyes. The yard had the quality of held breath made permanent. Nobody moved. Nobody looked at anyone else. When the storm came and Daunt sent me out to the north fence, I understood what it meant. He had learned from Yates that I knew the truth. He was sending me out because a dead man cannot testify to anything. I went, Dora. I want to be clear about why I went. I went because I had spent 90 nights deciding that the law was the right way to settle this, that anything else would put something on Clara's name and on yours that neither of you deserved to carry into the future. And I went because if I stayed and killed him instead, there would be no law. There would only be what I had done. The letter trembled once, and she pressed it flat and kept reading. There is a paper trail, Dora. There is always a paper trail. Find Orrin Yates. He is more afraid of going than he is of Daunt, and if you put it to him that way, he will speak. Find the man who put Silas Drum on the stage from Billings. Find Drum himself if you can. Find the station ledger and the transaction record. And when you have found it, take it to the county sheriff and let the law do what it was built to do. She paused. There is one more thing I need to tell you. There is a man on this ranch named Stellan Brook. He owns this property and he signed an order that Daunt used to send me out in that storm. I do not believe he knew what Daunt intended when he signed it. I have worked for this man for 8 months, and I have watched him carefully the way you watch a man when you are deciding whether he is worth trusting. Stellenbrook is a good man who made a bad mistake and who has been carrying it the way good men carry bad mistakes, which is to say badly alone and in the wrong direction, which is inward instead of outward, where it can be examined and dealt with. Dorothea looked up from the letter. She found Stellan's face in the yard without searching for it because she already knew precisely where he was standing, had known for the past several minutes the way you know where a wall is in a room you have learned to move through in the dark. He was looking at her. His face was the face of a man hearing his own interior spoken aloud by someone who could not have known it, and it was very still and very open in the way faces are when the ordinary management of expression has been suspended by something too true to be managed. She read the last lines. Trust him, Dora. He will want to help, and he will not know at first how to do it, because men like him never know at first, but he will find the way if you let him find it. Tell him I said so. Tell him I knew from watching him for 8 months that he was the kind of man who carries his debts rather than burying them. Tell him that is the only thing that matters about a man when everything else has been accounted for. She lowered the letter. The yard was still. She folded it in thirds the way Harlan had folded it, and she put it back in the tin and closed the lid. She put the tin in her apron pocket. Then she looked at Fergus Daunt. He was looking at the ground in front of his boots. The color that had left his face had not come back to it. You sent a false doctor to my daughter, she said. He did not look up. You sent a false doctor to my daughter to save $60. She said it with only the weight of the fact, without heat, without performance. Clara was 4 days old. She died of bleeding that could have been stopped. She died because you owed my husband $60 and found a way to pay less. Daunt's jaw moved. He started to say something. I am not finished, she said. He closed his mouth. There is a paper trail, Mr. Daunt. My husband was a careful man who did not believe things without basis. Orrin Yates is on this property right now, and he will testify to everything he told my husband in this bunkhouse. Silas Drum can be located. The billing stage records exist. The transaction can be traced from beginning to end. She looked at him steadily. Whatever you believe died with my husband on that north fence, I am going to find it. And when I find it, the law in this county is going to know your name in a way it does not know it yet. Daunt looked up, and something happened in his face that she had not anticipated. It did not go cold. It did not arrange itself back into the managed blankness he had maintained for 3 days. It did something she had not seen it do before. It collapsed, not into remorse, into the expression of a man who has been running from something for a long time and has just looked back and found that the distance has closed to nothing at all. He turned. He took 2 steps toward the corrals, not at a run this time, at the walk of a man who is moving because remaining still has become impossible. Stellan said his name. Daunt stopped. You are going to stand in this yard, Stellan said, until the sheriff arrives. Daunt turned slowly. The sheriff. I sent a wire from a town yesterday morning, Stellan said. The minute Mrs. Vance used the words paper trail in this kitchen on her second here I sent for Sheriff Aldrin. The warrant was drawn up last night. He will be here before midnight. The yard absorbed this. Dorothea looked at Stellan. He met her eyes and held them. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, and she could see from across the yard that it was old, the folds worn soft from being handled many times, the paper having taken on the limpnesses of something that has been carried too long. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at the yard. I want every person in this yard to hear what I am about to say, he said, and I want Fergus Daunt to hear it most of all. Nobody moved. This paper is the standing authorization I signed 3 years ago, giving Daunt full operational authority over this ranch on any night I was unavailable for consultation. My signature is at the bottom of it. The date it was signed is 14 months before the night of the storm. He looked at the paper in his hands. Daunt has been holding this paper for 8 months. He has used it to prevent me from acting against him, implying without ever stating directly that if I moved against him, he would use this paper to argue that I authorized the order that sent Harlan Vance out into that storm. The silence in the yard had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of people waiting to hear something. It was the silence of people who were hearing something they had not been prepared for. I am giving this paper to Mrs. Vance, Stellan said, because it belongs to her more than it belongs to anyone else. Harlan Vance worked for me. He trusted this ranch and he trusted my name. He died on this property under an order that my signature made possible regardless of whether that was my intention. I signed this paper. I owe Mrs. Vance the truth of that, and I will accept whatever follows from the truth. He crossed the yard to where she was standing and held the paper out to her. She took it. She looked at his signature at the bottom, the signature of a man who had, in that moment 3 years ago, been solving a practical problem without knowing what the solution would become. She looked at his face. "Thank you, Mr. Brooke," she said. Something moved in him when she said it, while visibly precisely. More the way a room changes when a window is opened in it, something in the quality of the air, a shift that was not about light but had a similar effect. He nodded once and stepped back. From Daunt's position in the yard came a sound, the sound of a man watching his last remaining lever cross the yard and change hands. "That paper doesn't prove anything," Daunt said. His voice had shed all its management now. It was only a voice rough and diminished the voice of a man saying words because silence is worse. That's an administrative document. It doesn't say anything about Vance. It doesn't say anything about a doctor. "No," Dorothea said, "it does not. The billing stage ledger says that, and Orrin Yates says that, and Silas Drum will say it when he is found." She looked across the yard to where Orrin Yates was standing near the back of the assembled men. He was perhaps 46 broad through the chest, weathered, and he was looking at the ground with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular moment for 11 months and is not entirely certain whether its arrival is a relief or a punishment. "Mr. Yates," she said. He looked up. "When the sheriff arrives tonight, you are going to tell him everything you told my husband in this bunkhouse. Every word of it." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. His throat moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said finally, and the words came out hoarse and certain, both at once. "I should have told it a long time before now." "Yes," she said, "but you are going to tell it now, and that will have to be what it is." The large Scandinavian hand, who appeared to require no instructions for situations where the correct action was clear, reached over and took Daunt by the back of his collar in the same unhurried grip as before and held him there with the patient certainty of a man who weighs 270 pounds and has settled on a course. Daunt did not struggle. The arithmetic had finished running. The sheriff arrived at midnight. He came with 2 deputies and a wagon, and the bearing of a man who has received a wire, has had time during the ride to construct a full picture of the situation, and has arrived with all decisions already made. He was perhaps 65 years old, with a white mustache and eyes that had been looking at difficult human situations for long enough to have ceased being surprised by any specific configuration they took. He came to Dorothea first on the kitchen porch where she was sitting with Miena Gall and Winifred Ames and a cup of coffee she was holding for warmth rather than drinking. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I am Sheriff Roland Aldrin. I am sorry about your husband, ma'am, and I am sorry about your daughter." She looked at him. "You know about Clara." Mr. Schrook's wire was thorough, ma'am. He had understood most of the shape of it before you read the letter, I believe. He sent me enough to write a warrant on and said the particulars would come with testimony. He looked at the tin in her lap. "I'll need that letter for the trial proceedings." She opened the tin. She took the letter out. Her hand did not tremble. She held it for a moment. The paper was only paper. Harlan was not in the paper. He was in the words, and the words were in her now, settled in the place where things go when they are important enough to be permanent. She could give the paper to the law and keep the words. She handed it to the sheriff. "He'll be held at the county seat," Aldrin said, indicating Don, who was being assisted into the back of the wagon by the two deputies with the efficient, impersonal manner of men who have done this many times and have a method for it. "The trial will be in the spring. You will be called to testify. Mr. Yates will be called. The man drum is being located." He paused. "I have known Fergus Daunt for 11 years, Mrs. Vance. I have wanted a sufficient reason to do this for 9 of them. You brought me one that will hold." He touched his hat. He walked back to the wagon, and the wagon moved out of the yard at midnight, and the sound of the wheels faded down the north road. And what remained in the yard was a silence that was different in kind from any silence the ranch had held since she arrived. Not the silence of tension waiting to release. The silence of something that has been wound very tight for a very long time and has finally in this moment been allowed to be simply still. The men drifted back to the bunkhouse. The women remained a little longer. Minna and Winifred and the others in the easy wordless company of people who have been through something together and are not ready yet to separate from it. Then Beckett drove them back to town in the wagon with Winifred sitting up beside him on the seat, instead of in the bed behind the two of them, talking quietly in the way of people who have needed to talk for a long time and have finally found the right night for it. Stellan came and sat on the porch steps, 2 feet away from her. He did not look at her. He looked at the dark yard. They sat without speaking for a while. The stars were very clear and very numerous. The Montana cold had settled in completely, now the kind that is simply present, not driven by wind, but permanently arrived. "Why did Harlan trust me?" Stellan said. "He had reasons not to. The paper, the fact that I knew and didn't act." "He watched you," she said. "For 8 months he watched you the way a careful man watches another man when he is deciding whether trust is warranted. He said you were the kind of man who carries his debts rather than burying them. He said that was the only thing that mattered about a man when everything else had been weighed." Stellan looked at his hands on his knees. "He was more generous than I had earned," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps he was simply accurate." She looked out at the dark yard. "Tonight, in front of everyone on this property, you handed me a paper that could have been used against you, and you spoke the truth about what it meant. The letter had already ended Daunt's position. You could have stayed quiet about the paper and no one would have known." "I would have known," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is exactly what Harlan meant." The silence between them was a comfortable one which surprised her. She had not come here expecting to find comfort of any kind, had not expected anything beyond the truth and the work and the necessary doing of what she had come to do. She had not expected the porch steps or the good silence of a man who understood when not to fill one. "They will talk about you," Stellan said. "In town. You should know that before it starts, so you hear it from me first." "I know." "They will say you only won the cook-off because of the letter and the women and the pity of hungry men. They will say any woman with a pot would have been sufficient. They will say you used Harlan's death as leverage." "I know what they will say." "It is going to be said persistently, Mrs. Vance, and loudly." She looked at him. "Mr. Brooke, I stepped off a stage 3 days ago with a knife wound on my shoulder and walked 6 miles in October mud because my husband's last wish was to see these men properly fed. I have cleaned a kitchen that had not been properly cleaned since spring. I have cooked for 31 men twice. I survived an arson attempt. I organized a public cooking competition. I read my husband's letter out loud in front of everyone in this yard, and in the morning I will get up and build the fire and start breakfast." She looked back at the yard. "Whatever they say in town, I expect I will manage it." Something in his face did what a smile does in the place where the face is not managed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I expect you will." They sat until the coffee was cold. Then she went inside and he went to the main house, and the ranch settled into a night that had finally become simply a night. In the morning she built the fire before dawn. She was at the stove with the biscuits in the oven when Toby came in, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, his hair in its usual defiant disorder. He stopped when the smell of the kitchen reached him and stood for a moment just inside the door. "Biscuits," he said. "And bacon," she said. "Get the eggs." He got the eggs. They worked in the rhythm they had been building since the first night, which was not yet the deep ease of long practice, but had the shape of it, two people who were learning each other's timing and finding that the learning was not difficult. "Ma'am," Toby said after a while, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Yes. What happens now?" "With everything." "The ranch continues," she said. "Men still need feeding. Work still needs doing. Nothing about the day-to-day that stops because a problem has been resolved." "I meant for you," he said. "What happens for you now?" She looked at the biscuits through the oven door. "I stay," she said. He looked up from the egg pan. "You stay." "I came here to do a job, Toby. The job is not finished because Daunt is in a county wagon. This kitchen needs a proper lock on the door and a second stove and someone who knows what they are doing in it." She looked at him. "You are learning, but you are not done learning yet." He went back to the eggs. After a moment, very quietly, he said, "Good." She did not let him see what happened to her face. After breakfast, when the men had gone to their work and the bunkhouse was quiet, she took the back of a feed receipt from the kitchen drawer and wrote at the top of it, things to build. Number 1, a proper lock on the kitchen door. Number 2, a second stove. The men were 31 now, and Stellan had mentioned hiring more before winter. Number 3, a bench along the kitchen wall. Not for any reason she could yet fully articulate, only a certainty clear and settled that the bench was going to be needed. Number 4, a sign above the door. She wrote Vance Kitchen. She looked at it. She drew a line through it. She wrote Harlan's Kitchen. She looked at it for a long time. She drew a line through it. She wrote Clara's Kitchen. She set the pencil down. She put both hands over her mouth. She sat at the kitchen work table and let it come, finally all of it that had been held back by the travel and the arriving and the work and the letter and the fur and the cook-off and everything that had needed to be done before the grief was allowed its full moment. She let it come now because The necessary things were done and the kitchen door had a chair propped against it, and there was no one here but her. She cried for 10 minutes. Then she washed her face at the basin, pushed up her sleeves, and went back to the stove. There were 31 men to feed at noon. The trial was held in the county seat in March when the roads had cleared enough for travel. Dorothea rode the train down with Minna Galt and Winifred Ames, sitting together in a compartment they filled mostly with the comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that words are not always the necessary medium. She sat by the window and watched Montana move past Brown and Vast and beginning to consider spring. Stellenbrook and Beckett Ames rode in the next car. They had been called as witnesses. They did not come into the women's compartment. They understood the way men sometimes understand without being told that what was being carried in that compartment was not theirs to handle. Beckett had married late in the year he turned 30, a steady young woman from a farm on the North Road. Their daughter, who had arrived the following year, was named Clara. Orrin Yates testified on the second day of the trial. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the floor and told the court everything he knew. The $4, the man from Billings, the laugh, he had laughed in the bunkhouse because he had thought Daunt had played a clever joke and that Harlan already knew the punchline. He told them about 11 months of not sleeping right and not eating right, and knowing from the morning Dorothea Vance walked into the yard with a knife wound on her shoulder that the day for the telling had arrived. He cried on the stand, 46 years old and broad through the chest, and he cried in the witness chair of a county courtroom because of a child he had never met and a woman he had watched walk 6 miles in October mud and a man he had wronged by laughing at the wrong moment. The physician from Billings testified on the third day. He produced his ledger. Under the date in question was a notation in a hand that matched precisely a letter Fergus Daunt had written to a livestock dealer 2 years prior, a letter Stellenbrook had kept in his desk drawer because he kept everything that moved through his office. There is always a paper trail. Harlan had written it, and he had been right. Silas Drum was found in Miles City working as a laborer. He was brought to testify. He was a small man and he could not look at Dorothea during his testimony. He told the truth because it was documented thoroughly enough that the alternative would have made his own situation considerably worse. The jury deliberated for 35 minutes. Fergus Daunt was found guilty on all counts. Dorothea sat in the gallery and heard the verdict and felt what she had not expected to feel, which was not the closing of a large door, but the opening of a quieter one. On the other side of it was a room that was simply still. She had not been in a room that was simply still in 2 years. She thanked Sheriff Aldrin outside the courthouse. She thanked Orrin Yates, which required a specific effort because gratitude and anger live in the same space in a person's chest and managing them simultaneously is not simple. She thanked him because he had done the right thing in the end, and the end was what the accounting required. She did not attend the execution. Mina asked her. Winifred asked her. The sheriff rode out to the ranch himself a week before to extend the invitation in person, in case she wanted to be present. She said no. She said, I have a kitchen to run and the men eat at noon. She fed them at noon. She fed them biscuits and stew and the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, and nobody at the table said anything about what day it was, and she was grateful for that. That was the end of Fergus Daunt. The sign went up in the spring. Stellan had carved it himself on Sunday afternoons over 3 weeks working in the barn with the door closed. Toby found him at it one Sunday and watched for a while in silence, and then went back to his work without saying anything, because Toby had developed over the months an accurate understanding of which moments belonged to other people. The sign read, Clara's Kitchen in letters an inch deep, cut carefully into a plank of good pine. Stellan put it up before breakfast on a Tuesday morning while Dorothea was at the stove. He nailed it above the door and climbed down and went to the far end of the yard to look at it. Toby came and stood beside him. They looked at it. "It's right," Toby said. "Yes," Stellan said. That was the whole of the conversation. Dorothea saw it when she came into the door to call the men to breakfast. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. Then she went back inside. Toby at the work table heard what he heard, and he did not look up, and he said nothing. And when she came back to the stove 10 minutes later, there was flour on her face, and her sleeves were pushed up, and that was all. The kitchen grew. By the second summer, Stellan had built her the second stove and extended the kitchen wall to accommodate it. By the third summer, the bench along the wall had been rebuilt twice because more women had begun coming than the original board on sawhorses could hold, and the rebuilt bench was proper timber with a back to it. The women came from the surrounding ranches first on Sundays, sitting on the bench with coffee and talking or not talking. These they chose because the bench and the coffee and the kitchen were there, and nobody asked them anything. Then they came from town, from the farms along the north road from further. A woman arrived from 20 miles east one afternoon with a bruise at her temple and a child on her hip, and no explanation at all. And Dorothea gave her a bowl of soup and a chair near the stove and asked for no explanation. And the woman came back the following week and the week after, and 6 months later, she had a room above the dry goods store in town and work at the seamstresses, and she named the child Clara. There were several Claras in the county before long. The school started in the 5th year. It was Toby's idea arrived at through a combination of watching Dorothea teach and a conversation with a woman in town who had read about cooking schools in the East. He brought it to Dorothea on a Tuesday morning with the defensive manner of someone proposing something they are not entirely certain will be received. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you haven't heard all of it." "I don't need to." "Yes." He looked relieved in the specific way of someone who had braced for a longer conversation. "It would be on Tuesdays," he said, "since May handles the men's meals on Tuesdays now." May was the widow from Missouri who had come to work in the kitchen in the 2nd year, a compact and efficient woman of 50 who had a gift for soup that Dorothea considered genuinely remarkable, and had said so, which May had received by looking at her boots and saying she'd never had anyone put it quite that way. "Tuesdays," Dorothea said. "All right." She did not call it a school. She called it the kitchen on Tuesdays because the kitchen on Tuesdays was what it was, and because the word school kept certain women away, women who had been told in various ways throughout their lives that school was not intended for them, and Dorothea preferred not to spend effort overcoming a word when the thing itself could do the work. Women came from everywhere eventually. From town and from the railroad camps and from ranches a day's ride away. They came because Minna Galt had told another woman who had told another woman that there was a kitchen at a ranch outside Holt's Ford where a woman had fed 30 cowboys cornbread from a tin plate and made a man stand in front of all of them and say her dead husband's name out loud, and that you could go there on Tuesdays and she would teach you things without asking what your situation was. She taught them what her mother had taught her and what she had learned in the years since, and what she had worked out in this kitchen over the years she had been in it. She taught them to soak beans and break down a quarter of beef and make bread that tasted like something. She taught them to cook on very little because most of them were cooking on very little. And she taught them that very little handled correctly was a different skill than abundance, one that required more from the cook rather than less. A Norwegian woman came one Tuesday who taught Dorothea a flatbread her mother had made in a city across an ocean, and Dorothea taught it back to her with rendered fat instead of butter, because butter was 4 times the price and the fat was already there. And the Norwegian woman cried quietly and then taught her a second flatbread as if in exchange. She taught them all the same thing at the center of everything else, which was that food was not a substance. Food was a language, a thing the body understood before the mind had found words for it, a thing that said, I see you and I am here, and you do not have to manage this moment alone. Her mother had cooked this way her whole life without thinking about it, the way fluent speakers of a language speak without translating. Dorothea had learned it consciously, deliberately, and she tried to pass it both ways, the practice of it and the understanding of what the practice meant. She was not always certain she succeeded. She was always certain it mattered. Toby Lark became the foreman of Brook Ranch in the year he turned 25. This happened without any particular ceremony. Stellan telling him one morning that the position was his, if he wanted it, and Toby saying, yes, ma'am, by instinct, and then correcting himself and Stellan declining to acknowledge the slip, and both of them proceeding as though it had not occurred. He sat at the head of the long table from that point on, in the chair that had been Harlan's, and then briefly Daunt's, and then empty, and when new men came to the ranch, they assumed the chair had always been his, and he never told them otherwise. He was a fair foreman and a patient one. He remembered that he had arrived in this kitchen at 17 years old, not knowing how to soak a bean, and this made him patient with men who did not know things, which is the most useful quality a foreman can possess. Dorothea watched him sit at the head of that table and felt something she eventually identified as a form of continuation. Stellan Brooke did not propose to Dorothea until the 6th year. This was not for lack of wanting to. She understood later that the want had been present since the morning after the cook-off, from the porch steps and the cold tea and the Montana stars, and the silence that had settled between them, like something that had always been there and had finally been permitted to exist. He had not asked because he had been waiting for her to be ready. He did not know that was what he was doing. He simply waited with the patience of a man who has learned that certain things cannot be rushed without being broken. She did not know she was ready until the Tuesday in October, when the last student of the day had gone home, and she was alone in the kitchen with the work table, and Stellan came in with his hat in his hand, the way he had come in 1,000 times. Mrs. Vance, he said. Mr. Brooke. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with something in his other hand, a small, plain wooden box. She had seen the shape of it in his coat pocket on Sundays for 4 years and had not said anything about it because some things deserve to arrive in their own time. Ask me, she said. He blinked. Ma'am, you have been carrying that box for 4 years, Mr. Brooke. Ask me. His face did something she had not seen it do in 6 years, which was to go entirely transparent, all the habitual composure suspended by the simple fact of being seen clearly by someone who had been paying attention. He opened the box. It was not a ring. It was a small carved bird, a wren, she thought, from the particular angle of the tail. The carving was detailed and careful, the work of someone who had taken the time to get the small things right. There was a boy, Stellan said, in town 6 years ago, the morning you arrived. He ran after the stage to try to help you, and you wouldn't let him help you, and he came and found me instead and told me a woman was walking the North Road alone with a wound on her shoulder. Eli Crane. He was 19 years old. He looked at the carved bird. Again, he died of fever that first winter. I carved this for him because I never properly thanked him. I have carried it since then because I needed something that reminded me that debts exist in the world and that a man's job is to pay them, not to pretend they don't. He looked up at her. I needed not to forget that. She looked at the bird. She thought about a 19-year-old boy running after a stagecoach on a muddy October street with his hat clutched to his chest, trying to help a stranger who refused to be helped, going to find the man who could help instead. She thought about Harlan's letter, the kind of man who carries his debts rather than burying them. She thought about 6 years of Sundays in the shape of that box in a coat pocket, and a man who had ridden his horse in the grass for 2 miles because he would not leave and would not impose. Stellan, she said. It was the first time in 6 years she had said his given name. They both noticed it. Neither of them mentioned it. Ask me, she said again. He looked at her across the kitchen, across the work table they had stood on opposite sides of for 6 years, across the space between them that she understood now had been narrowing steadily, without either of them acknowledging it the way rivers narrow as they approach a certain place in the land. Dorothea Vance, he said, will you marry me? She looked at the kitchen, at the sign above the door, at the second stove he had built for her and the bench along the wall, and the work table with its years of marks and the ghost of 10,000 meals. At the corner where she had cried for 10 minutes the morning after the cook-off, which now felt like something that happened in a previous life and also like yesterday. At the place on the shelf above the kitchen door where the tin had been. Yes, she said. Yes, Stellan, I will marry you. He cried. She had known he was capable of it, but she had not anticipated this particular moment, not this directness, not without the management he usually maintained. She crossed the kitchen. She took the wooden bird out of his hand and set it on the work table. She put her hands on either side of his face. Stellan, I have loved you, he said, since the night you sat on the porch steps and told me that carrying a thing alone in the dark makes it heavier. I have loved you since the road, Dora, since I rode my horse in the grass for 2 miles because you would not let me on the road beside you, and I did not want to leave. I know you have, she said. How do you know? Because a man who does not love a woman does not walk his horse in the grass for 2 miles, she said. He goes home. They were married in the yard the following spring under a canopy. The men built from the long table's planks, turned on end, and hung with branches and lengths of ribbon that May had ordered from town 3 months in advance and kept secret with what Dorothea later described as extraordinary discipline. Minna Galt stood for Dorothea. Beckett Ames stood for Stellan. Toby Lark walked Dorothea down the row of assembled men, 38 of them. Now all with their hats held against their chests, and at the end of the row, Stellan was standing in a clean shirt with his hat in his hand and an expression he had given up managing sometime around dawn. When the minister asked Dorothea if she would take this man, she said, I will. When the minister asked Stellan if he would take this woman, he said, I already have. The men made enough noise to send 4 horses over the corral fence. Beckett and the large Scandinavian ran them down on foot, and the wedding waited 20 minutes for the horses to be retrieved and the men to come back, sweating and laughing. And by then the bride and groom were on the kitchen porch drinking lemonade and laughing too, and the minister was on his 3rd piece of cornbread and appeared entirely at peace with the world. That was how Dorothea Vance became Dorothea Brooke. 20 years after she had stepped off the stage in Holtzford with a knife wound on her shoulder and a wedding ring clutched in her fist, a young woman arrived at Clara's kitchen from Chicago. She was 22 years old and she had a notebook and 3 sharpened pencils and the energy of someone who has traveled a significant distance for a reason she believes in. She had been sent by her newspaper to write about the woman some people in the territory were beginning to call the mother of the Montana kitchen, which Dorothea considered an overstatement and said so, and the young woman wrote it down anyway. She asked many questions over 2 days. Dorothea answered them with a directness she applied to everything, having long since lost patience for answers that were less than direct. On the second afternoon, the young woman asked the question that had been underneath all the other questions since she arrived. "Mrs. Brooke," she said, "when you stepped off that stage in 1883, did you know you were going to win?" Dorothea looked out the kitchen window. In the yard, 60 men were at the long table for the noon meal hats off the sound of talk and tin on tin in the clear October air. At the head of the table, Toby Lark sat in a chair that fit him the way chairs fit people who have occupied them long enough for the chair to learn their particular shape. On the bench along the kitchen wall, Beckett Ames's daughter was sitting with Annie, who had come to work in the kitchen 8 years ago learning to fold a biscuit the right way. The girl was 8 years old with her father's sandy hair and her grandmother Winifred's uprightness and the focused attention of a child who has already figured out that learning useful things is more interesting than not learning them. Her name was Clara. Dorothea looked at all of it for a long moment, at the yard and the table and the sign above the door and the bench along the wall and the two stoves behind her and the work table with its years of marks. She had not stepped off that stage to find any of this. She had stepped off that stage to cook a meal for 30 men who were eating burned beans because her husband had asked her to without quite getting to the asking, and because someone had to. She had not known the cooking would lead to the letter, or the letter to the trial, or the trial to the kitchen, or the kitchen to the school, or the school to the bench full of women, or any of it. She had only known the next step. Each time only the next step. She turned back to the young woman. She looked at her the way she had looked at Fergus Daunt across the work table on the night of the cook-off, with the full and level attention she gave to everything that mattered, which was to say without softening and without performance. "No," she said, "I did not step off that stage to win. I stepped off that stage to cook. A woman who knows what she came to do does not need to win. She needs to show up. She needs to roll up her sleeves. She needs to light the fire. And she needs to keep cooking until the men who said she couldn't are long gone, and the ones who said she could are sitting at her table asking for the recipe." She paused. "That is not winning," she said. "That is building. And building is the only thing in this world that lasts." The young woman wrote it down word for word because she understood that these were words that lose something in the paraphrase. It was printed in the Chicago paper 6 weeks later. It was reprinted in the Montana paper the week after that. It was cut out by women across many states and pinned to kitchen walls. And some of those walls were not kitchen walls in the literal sense, but were the walls of whatever room was for the woman in question, the place where she went to do the work that mattered and to be who she was without performing it for anyone. Dorothea Brooke died in her sleep at the age of 78 in the bedroom Stellan had built for her behind Clara's kitchen in the good dark of a November night in 1927. Stellan held her hand. May was in the chair by the window asleep in it, having refused to go home. In the kitchen, 40 feet away, through two walls and a corridor, a pot of beans was soaking in cold water for the morning's breakfast because Dorothea had put them on to soak before she went to bed, the way she had done every night for 24 years. The words from the interview were read at her burial by Clara Ames, who was 37 years old by then, who had learned to read on Sunday afternoons in this kitchen, who had grown up into the uprightness of her grandmother Winifred and the steadiness of her father Beckett, and something else besides something that had been given to her in a kitchen over many years by a woman who believed that the act of feeding people was a form of love that did not require the word. Clara Ames stood at the head of the grave and read the last sentence of the interview slowly and clearly, the way Dorothea had taught her to read, which was with attention to each word, and with the understanding that words spoken aloud travel differently than words on a page, that they go into the air and then into the people who hear them, and that what goes in that way stays. Every soul at the grave heard it. Every soul standing on the road outside the fence heard it. And building is the only thing in this world that lasts. The November wind moved through the grass. The beans went on soaking in the kitchen. And the morning came as mornings do without asking anyone's permission.